What is up? Welcome to the Pure Desire podcast on YouTube. Lives and relationships are being destroyed by unwanted sexual behavior and betrayal trauma. Our goal with this podcast is to have weekly conversations that give encouragement, experience, and expertise on how to take your life back from the effects of unwanted sexual behavior and betrayal. We sit down with Pure Desire staff, addiction and betrayal experts, and other voices in the recovery world to help you take back your life from the effects of unwanted sexual behavior. My name is Trevor Windsor, and I am the host of this podcast. If you enjoy the podcast, please like, subscribe, and share it with others. All right, here's this week's episode. All right, Bob and Rebecca Vander Meer, we're glad to have you back in studio. It has been a long time since we've had both of you on the podcast, especially in studio. So we're glad you're here.
This studio is legit.
Thank you.
This is nice.
Thank you, Luke Meyer. Shout out Luke Meyer.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir. You've done an excellent job.
Crushing it.
We're excited. Genuinely, it's cool to see you guys. It's been a long time. COVID, obviously, that has thrown some, obviously some wrenches in the engine, so to speak. Whatever. I'm not a car guy. Anyways, we wanted to have you guys on because of your positions here being clinicians, and you work with couples every single day that are working through recovery and betrayal. And we had a listener who sent in a recommendation for, what do I do if I'm afraid to re-engage sexually with my spouse, or if my spouse is fearful of re-engaging sexually during the recovery process? And we figure this is a great episode to have you guys on. We also did an episode with you guys, which is one of my favorites, the Sex During Recovery episode. So it felt like this is like just another iteration of the same conversation.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's just jump in. For men and women recovering and healing from the impact of sexual brokenness, they may have fear around this. The first question is it normal? And if so, can you guys talk through the fear that they are going to feel? And I mean, just talk about that. What are the fears that someone brings in recovery and healing?
Yeah, I mean, the first question, is it normal? Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely. The topic of sex already, at this point for any couple, already has shame attached to it, right? It's already been problematic for them. I mean, there's a variety of stuff all mixed up in it, right? So yeah, I mean, I think just talking about it is going to be challenging. It's going to include some fear. Yeah.
And with that being said, then some of those fears that a lot of people, it's just very common for most people, is whether there's a fear of being used, mostly on the spouse side of things, if she's being used, if the addict is a man, of course, if this person is being used for sex, but then there's also shame that may come up afterwards for both, whether it's for the addict or the spouse. There's also that fear of maybe not having enough sex that comes up very much for everybody. I feel like even and also maybe even the fear of trying to keep the addict from acting out and just having that fear of I have to or I won't, out of that fear
that
of
feels like
the
a big
possibilities.
one. That feels like one where because I think that was some of where the question came from this listener too, was like, I've been working really hard on my recovery, and will re-engaging sexually with my spouse reignite my addiction? Like, will it just like everything just goes right back to what it was before? Right. And there's that trepidation in trying to engage with your spouse.
Yeah, because it's like, well, man, this stuff that I was so familiar with in my addiction, whether it was with like, an affair partner or in pornography, like, can I do this like now in a healthy sense where afterwards I don't feel shame over it? Like, is this dirty, right? Because I mean, is this position okay? Is that position not okay? I mean, just all of these questions that are there that are connected to past challenges at the very least. Yeah.
Well, if you think about it, it's such a personal, intimate area of our relationship. And when there's been wounding there's a lack of trust there. I mean, we talk about it on so many of these episodes. It's really traumatic. And I mean, particularly for the betrayed spouse, the one that's wounded in that way. But I think in what you guys have been discussing, there is even some trauma if the addicted or struggling spouse is really getting honest about their behaviors. They're probably encountering some of their own pain of the way I've hurt people or the choices I've made, how it's damaging relationships. And so when you think about sex, it's like for both partners, it might be we're going back to a place that was traumatic or that has caused a lot of pain and what will happen. And you think of if a person was in some kind of serious event on a plane that crashed or had a significant engine failure and that was trauma, like you would expect the next flight, if you take one again, some of those feelings might come back. You'd be like, oh, we'll just get over it, because airplanes never crash. Like,
Right.
Yeah.
well, yeah, but the one I was on did,
Exactly.
and it was
Sure.
scary,
Yeah.
and I don't want to go
Totally.
through that again. And so
The
I
possibility
think
is
if we
there.
can just normalize that in a way that people can talk about it, and that's the purpose of groups
Yeah.
and counseling
Yeah.
and having those kind of relationships to say, what do we do about this? Because I think if you don't talk about it, it's more likely that fear is just going to stay there and become part of the way you're relating to each other.
Yeah. I think one of our questions later, there's some good stuff that I'm looking forward to unpacking with that too. But like on the addict side also, I think there's the fear of like, well, once we re-engage in this, is it going to be as frequently as I want?
Yeah.
Right? Like, because now there's all this negative stuff and they've compartmentalized their addiction from sex with their spouse oftentimes. And so like, there's like, well, yeah, that's cool. Like I've been working on this stuff over here,
Yeah.
but I hope that this doesn't change. Like I hope that this is still just as much as I, need.
Right.
We
Yeah.
use that word need, which,
Totally.
We get rid of that word, but it's not.
Or we even have people who struggle, and the mindset can be, well, if I get healthier, we'll have sex more
Yeah.
because now I'm
Right.
better, so they should want it more. And
Yeah.
we just ignore a whole lot of other things that get in the way and can cause some trouble there. So let's keep diving into it. The next question we wanted to ask is just related to maybe that perception for couples going into it. And it's this: can we really heal and have a healthy sex life? And as you were saying, Bob, that can be compartmentalized where we feel like, yeah, I know we can heal, and emotionally we can work through things, and I can work on my issues with pornography, but will our sex life ever be healthy? I think some people wonder, will there just always be a shadow over that part of my life now?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's part of the recovery process, that it's a never ending growth and learning journey. With that being said, then yes, we truly believe and have seen change and healing in that area. However, it is work, like any change that you want to make and maintain. It is work, and so sex will need to be something new for the couple, and that so many times just has to start with your own personal self-awareness, healing, and growth, as well as that intimacy that it's based on the emotional connection between the couple.
Yeah. I mean, I love what you said about it has to be something new, because if we think that like the healing and change if we think that the healing and the change is going to be like, oh yeah, we're going to pick up where we left off. Like, no, I mean, that old timeline, that old way of approaching things, like maybe even the old routines that they had, maybe the old routine was like we do this, we have a glass of wine, like we start
the
out
initiating process.
Yeah, the initiating, like the foreplay, like the
ritual,
like what the ritual was, like even that. Okay, well, did we ever talk about that? Like, was part of that actually part of the addictive behavior and ritual? And did this like spouse feel engaged and loved and cared for? And so I think in this whole idea of the healing process is also to say, all right, we might just need to set all of that aside and reinvent what this looks like for us.
Yeah, I think we've said it on probably more than half the podcasts we've done, that we're not here to stop a behavior. We're here to change the way you do life. And if I'm looking to do life differently, then the intimacy I share with my spouse on a physical, sexual level will be different. Different doesn't mean good or bad, but it does mean different. And for some couples, I know it means they will have sex more frequently because they rediscover some passion. They rediscover healthy reasons to be physically intimate. And other couples, it means it's less frequent because they realized what was driving it was more a false sense of libido or manliness or things that just weren't even necessary. And as they let go of that, they realize, I don't have this need, quote unquote, that I thought I had. And so I think if we're open to that, like it will be different. Then the answer is yes, it can be healthy. It may not look the same, and it probably should not look the same, because that would indicate we're not doing life differently. We're just trying to stop a bad behavior. So,
and we're trying to create more safety and security in that relationship. And so as recovery and healing is happening, and that connection and that safety that you feel, because obviously trust and safety are broken at discovery, right? Like that's just, it's not there anymore. And so that process of that being recovered, that's a part of this too. We're going to laugh real quick just because your daughter is in studio eating carrots.
With headphones on.
With headphones on.
You can't hear
It's so
anything.
great. So you should watch this on YouTube if you're listening. But I just think that that's so important to consider that, yes, the frequency may be different, even the intensity may be different, but the hope is that as you re-engage, it becomes something that's safer.
Yeah.
And because of that, I think over time will be more enjoyable for both spouses.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what a beautiful goal to have
Yeah.
is to get to a place in life with your spouse where sex is one of the best things in your relationship because you've actually put the work forth and you've grown and you're at a better place than you were before. So.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So let's say a couple is here and they have some fear, concern going into re-engaging. They feel like they're at a place where this is on the table now. This is a conversation. What are some suggestions or tips that you guys would have for couples in that space?
Yeah. I think one is to take your time re-engaging. Like there doesn't need to be a rush.
Yeah.
Right. Take your time. At this point in the process, you're probably having conversations you've never had before anyways. Right. And so let's have conversations
It's
about
just on par with that.
Yeah. Right. Let's keep having those
For sure.
those rigorously honest, vulnerable conversations where you're talking about the things of your ritual, the things of your patterns, like the things of I don't know, like how's the bedroom, like what's the light, what I mean, like talk about all that, but there's no rush. Like don't feel pressured to rush to jump back into bed because that didn't solve anything before, and it's not going to solve anything now.
Sure.
Right.
Right? It can be part of something,
Yeah.
but just like take your time.
Which then to be able to take time, we go back to kind of what I mentioned a few minutes ago is that focus on the pursuit of emotional health first, which then if you are doing that as a couple, then it'll be easier to have those conversations so that when you re-engage, you're able to feel safe, to be seen, to be heard, and to even know what your preferences are and dislikes. And so it's very important to focus on that emotional health first.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about how our sexual connection is meant to be an overflow of the intimacy we're sharing as a couple. And so that's what I think of in recovery. If we're at a level where that intimacy is really growing and developing, and we feel like sexual connection is kind of the logical outflowing of where we're headed, then great. And if you're not there, I think it's not trying to run ahead of where your intimacy is at as a couple and not trying to force it or just make that feeling of connection come through sex if it's not happening in other places. And again, I really think in this area, for every couple, it looks a little different. There's not like, it'll take this amount of time and then you'll do this. Just depending on the level of wounding, the level that it's been happening, how long into marriage they are. Is it the first marriage? There's so many questions I think that would determine the differences there, but just kind of letting it be whatever it is for your timeline. Yeah. And the other thing I was thinking about when you asked the question is just making sure as a couple you're able to talk about it, to acknowledge it with each other. And if need be, even being the one who's willing to ask the partner, like, do you have fears about this? Let's talk about it so that, and my goal, if I'm the spouse asking that, it's so that I can truly listen and hear and validate, like, I can understand why you would feel that way. And whether I'm the betrayed spouse or the struggling one, to just recognize my partner may have concerns. And as they share them, I listen, I welcome them, and I try to understand, and then maybe ask questions of what could we do together that might help address some of those fears or alleviate them. And I think the more we've talked about it, then we feel like, I'm heard, I'm seen, I'm understood, and I might feel like we can keep moving then towards those fears rather than avoiding them.
Something to just an extension of that, and I know that people know this already, we've talked about this before, but comparison in recovery is really hurtful. Like where you're at in recovery and comparing myself to that, like maybe we're in the same group or something, I feel like that's always harmful. And same thing with this topic. Like maybe you've got someone in group who like them and their spouse are now engaging sexually and you and your spouse are not. It's not a comparison game, to your point, that your journeys and your stories are so different as to what has happened. And so just to take that into consideration, that comparison, the way I've always thought of it is that whenever comparison is made, someone loses, and you just don't want to create that dynamic.
Yeah. With with this question, because was it some suggestions, right, that they have a concern about re-engaging. Don't think about fear as roadblocks to re-engaging sexually. Like think about these fears as really keys to unlocking emotional intimacy, right? Because the fears are there because of past stuff. And so if the fear is a roadblock, then we're going to be afraid to talk about it. We're going to try to avoid them. We're going to think of them as obstacles. as opposed to, like Nick, what you said, if we ask like, hey, what is your fear? Why is that fear there? Then all of a sudden, as we begin unpacking why these fears are there, like we talk about our past, we talk about our trauma, we talk about our own relationship, which like provides opportunity for emotional intimacy, right? And so now that emotional intimacy now becomes like a key to better connection, whether it's emotionally or sexually.
Totally.
Yeah, and even having a perspective of coming to those conversations with a good sense of curiosity, like wanting to understand, to know your partner, whatever that may be in terms of whether it's fears or likes, dislikes, all of this. Just having that approach can be so helpful because we're removing all those other assumptions, all those other unknowns, but more so have this spirit of, I'm curious, I really legitimately want to get to know you better so that we can connect better.
Yeah. So we talked about this in the episode on sex during recovery, but I think it's good to bring up again in this context of people who are experiencing fear about sex and how to work through that. What would you say in terms of discussing and implementing abstinence during the recovery process, and how would that relate to this topic of fear of sex?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we recommend it almost always, and so but that's in a clinical setting. And so I think if you're in,
you have someone who's guiding you through that process.
Correct. Yeah. So when I say we, I mean Rebecca and I, like with clients, right?
Yeah.
And so, but I mean, we would say engage in it with support. So if you're going to participate in an abstinence period, make sure you have support. So like from a counselor, or that both of you are in a group. So you've got support, right? You've already, and also don't do it at the very beginning of recovery. Because like your world is spinning out of control. And what we don't want is we don't want you to try to have an abstinence period and then just like crash and burn, where the addict is now making advances at his wife and she's feeling used, and then she feels like she has to give in, but then he can't stop. So then they end up having sex, and then, right. And we'll get to that in a minute, but basically like if you do it too early and you don't have support, then it can end up being kind of worse off. I mean, it ends up being kind of a traumatic thing. So
and you at the beginning of the process, you're learning so much about your new reality that it's important that you are educated in a sense, right? That you understand, that you have a better understanding of what it is that you're walking through in the moment. But that being said, then once you're a little bit further in your process, having a plan in place is huge in terms of what should we focus on during this time. What should we do with our nights, with our time together? Because then again, you're not trying to just figure it out in the moment or on the spot or having all these uncertainties, but having an agreement where you're both, again, right, communicating, having that emotional health connection where it's like, okay, let's talk about this. What are some things that would mean a lot to you physically without it being sexual? And
I guess one quick thought on this too is to differentiate between a therapeutic abstinence period and you just found out through discovery or disclosure and you want this person as far away from you physically as possible, right? Like differentiate between those two. Like, so it may be appropriate for you that when there's discovery or when there's disclosure, that like to create some space where sex isn't happening. And that like, that's about safety. That's about, and I think what we're talking about more so now is like a therapeutic abstinence period.
Both parties agreeing upon this.
Absolutely. And you're doing it not just for the safety, I need you away from me, but you're doing it so that you can get to a place where you can re-engage sexually again with health.
Well, and I feel like in our last conversation about this, that there's like a reset period where you're allowing yourself to kind of hit a baseline again. And then reinvent, as we've already talked about, what normal is. And what I love about this is the idea of putting a plan in place is that it's something that you're creating also the expectations for both parties. That if there's an agreed upon time, and this is what the process will look like, then, let's say the struggling spouse, if they want to re-engage, if there's not expectations, they might re-engage. That might end up being like damaging to their relationship if there's, tension there. But if it's like, we know that we're going to do it for 6 months, and then when we come back and reevaluate, and that the timeline is going to be between you and your support. But once you come back, then you have those expectations. And I feel like that will help both spouses both the betrayed spouse in preparing for that conversation, and then also the struggling spouse as they're thinking through, this has a time period in place. I don't have to just like not ever try to make advances on my spouse again for the rest of our marriage, but have that right expectation going into it.
Yeah, we typically also recommend it like in a clinical setting, like that it would be after a formal disclosure. Because we wouldn't want them to engage in this abstinence period where they're working on emotional intimacy, building trust, building connection, and then you throw a disclosure in there and some bombs get dropped, right? So we would recommend this after a disclosure so that whatever connection they're working on, whatever trust might be being built, whatever risk is being taken emotionally doesn't get totally undermined by this disclosure bomb.
You throw the disclosure grenade.
Yeah.
And everything gets,
Well, and that's what I wanted to reemphasize what you said there, Bob. Really, in this whole episode, we're kind of assuming two individuals that are both working towards their health, that are having a level of traction, and there's not issues within the marriage of extramarital affairs or maybe abusive, painful things being done to the other person where they're not safe in the home or safe in the bedroom, because I think that just needs to be stated, because there is some undercultures in, I mean, let's say it within particularly Christianity that can communicate, especially to the woman, like, well, you just need to grin and bear it. You just need to be available. You need to help meet his needs. And as we've discussed on many podcasts lately, like that's not healthy, right, or good. And so if you're in that situation where there's other people that you've discovered are part of this equation, or there's abusive things happening, the fear of sex is very legitimate and maybe will never be on the table again. And so you just need, and in those situations, with the help of friends and a counselor, to determine if that's a place you're in. This whole conversation maybe doesn't apply to you, because you need to determine if this relationship is something that should be worked on. And if you are, in particular, the betrayed spouse, the female, who's realizing, I've been really put in some very dangerous positions, it's not healthy for you to be asking these questions right now. So hopefully those that listen are kind of tempering it through some of that filter. And believing, even if you're currently a spouse who is in that really negative place where this conversation shouldn't be on the table, maybe at some point down the road, even in another marriage, you may be still coming back to some of this trauma of, well, I found out I had a spouse that was doing all these things. The marriage did not last, nor should it, and so we divorced. But you'll remarry statistically at some point, and it's very likely that maybe even after several years, you'll be back into the trauma of, I don't know how I feel about sex. I don't know if I should be re-engaging. And so these principles can apply in that season of life as well, even if right now it's not the right conversation to be having.
Because I thank you for saying that, Nick. And I think to that point too, I mean, if you're on that side of things where this is not an appropriate conversation for you right now, and you're not having sex because like you just found out, there's discovery, disclosure, like also practical things like go and get tested for STDs. Ask your addict spouse to also go get tested, right? I mean, you're not having sex right now. Before you re-engage, right? Like, let's make sure that everyone is also safe.
In place that this is safe, this is appropriate.
Yeah, and so what we're talking about is kind of presupposing that we're not in that place, that we're at a different place in the process. I think a real practical thing too, and what Rebecca was saying about like have a plan, is for the couple to make, basically both of them have a list of things that they would like to do with each other. So they each make their own list of, hey, this is what we're going to do.
Non-sexual things?
Non-sexual things that we're going to do over the next, whatever the time period is for the abstinence period. Here's our list. Combine that list and then put it on a calendar. Right. So maybe it's, I want to go on walks with you a couple times. Great. Then put that on a calendar. I want to go, do like a painting class with you. Great. Put it on a calendar. Right. I mean, so to take these non-sexual, emotional, connecting things, both of you have a list of things that you would like to do. Put that list together and put it on a calendar. Otherwise, the stuff's not going to happen. And you're going to go through 3 months of no sex and just didn't have any conversations.
You just grin and bear it. And all it's over. Like, all right.
All you did was just not have sex. Like you go on a mission trip and do that.
Well, and the whole point of that, again, is to re-engage emotionally. You're creating intimacy in the relationship, which eventually will later, obviously pour out into a sexual
Yeah.
relationship when you can re-engage. But I like that because you're getting to know your spouse on an emotional level as well there, and
Yeah.
that's what we're after ultimately.
Yeah.
Not just a better sex life, but a better marriage.
Yeah.
Because you're closer.
And there's more pointers that we gave on the podcast that we did before.
Yeah, go back and listen to it. We'll put it in
Yeah.
the show notes. Okay. So at what point in the recovery process should couple, and again, I know this is kind of a question where it's like, well, it depends. But at what point in the recovery process should couples re-engage sexually, and what should that process look like? And maybe, for you guys with your clients, like, what are you looking for before you maybe encourage, okay, we think you guys are ready to re-engage?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest things is when they are both ready, when they feel like they are ready. Granted, maybe this is coming as a result of afterward the abstinence period, and there are couples that they go through this period, and the date comes around, and they are actually not ready.
Yeah.
And whether it's because they don't feel like they're there yet emotionally, or because they are at such a good place that they realize, you know what? It's great, but we don't have to make this huge event with blowing whistles and for the night off, right? Or the day off. It's like,
candles
okay.
lit, streamers in the room.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, but then again, that should be a result of that emotional work where they're able to communicate and be honest with, I'm not ready, or I'm ready, and this is why, and go along with that.
Yeah, sure. Because there's a lot of addicts where as soon as they start the abstinence period, they've got like a countdown timer going. And
like a popcorn chain.
And same for the spouse. Like countdown, like in the opposite. To where like the anxiety.
Don't do that, because your spouse may add links to that over time.
Yeah, they might be real links in a real chain.
Careful.
And like that happens oftentimes at the front end of the abstinence period, where that's all they're thinking about.
Yeah. Sure.
And so then there's this pressure leading up to to perform to whatever, like on this day at this time.
Yeah.
I think we had a client one time who even like at midnight woke his wife up and was like, okay, and we're like, no, don't do that, right?
Yeah.
And so there's times where regularly I'll recommend to the addict, like, listen, the best maybe thing that you can do is the day that your abstinence period is done, like set up a date so you guys go out and you tell your wife, we are not going to have sex tonight. Like, I want you to know this is so important to me that we are emotionally connected, that sex tonight is not even an option for me. Like, I want you to know that I'm not just jumping in bed with you the first chance I get, though I miss you and I want you and I, whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, don't you think that's kind of a signature of the healing process, that for the addict, sex has become an idol, acting out, that physical rush has become a god that in a sense is central to their life, and they have to have it.
Yeah.
And healing for that struggler looks like it's not as important anymore. They've had appropriate things occupy their thoughts and attention and the center of their life. Yeah. And sex, if they're married, has become an appropriate part of that relationship. And I think if that's true for the addict, then that's also true for the marriage. That if sex has been like what the marriage is about, and all the focus and energy is on are we having it or are we not, health is actually, it's just becoming an aspect of a much healthier relationship that's in the middle. And I think when you feel that happening, again, the timeline for some couples, depending on what's happened, might be relatively short. For other couples, that might take a while.
Yep.
Yeah.
But I think when you see that of like, we can re-engage sexually, not because it's the biggest thing in our life, but because we both feel safe, we feel like we'd enjoy it, and we feel like it would really fit within the connection we have with each other.
Yeah. And you'd mentioned earlier about just like the trauma of a spouse. Right. I mean, at the end of this, if the addict is saying, all right, the time's up, like, let's go, like that also might bring up some of the betrayal trauma that the spouse was already dealing with, right?
I have to perform. I have to make them feel something.
Yeah. As opposed to like, hey, listen, I know our time's up, but like, let's just sit down and reevaluate.
Yeah.
Like, have we met our goals?
Yeah.
And if not, then what do we need to do to move forward and meet those goals? But what we don't want to do is re-traumatize a spouse, because like, you're coming in all ready to go.
Yeah. What, just kind of a like offshoot kind of question. What if the betrayed spouse before that time period comes to a close, if they communicated, I think I'm ready? Like, should couples then, would you encourage them, okay, engage at that point? I'm watching your face and I'm like, I don't really know what you're trying to get at. So.
I know what you're saying. I would say, oh, you don't know what my face means?
Yeah.
My face is like, nah. I mean, I'd say no.
Okay.
Like, even if a spouse comes and says, you know what, I think I'm ready. That might be out of her own trauma, out of her own insecurity.
Yeah.
Like, she's maybe feeling insecure
Got it.
and feels like she needs to pull him close,
Okay.
or pull the, him or her, whatever, pull the addict close.
Yeah.
And for
Yeah.
the addict, it's really important. Like, they agreed.
Right.
We're doing X amount of days of abstinence.
And follow through is huge in recovery.
And it's huge.
Yeah.
Structure
Okay.
is.
And she might she might be upset. She might feel rejected. She might have to process through all of that.
Yeah.
But in the end, I'll let you talk.
Yeah, and if anything, that is just a great message or a great indicative that there may be some more betrayal trauma that needs to be worked through. Because during this abstinence period, it's important that the spouse is focusing on its own betrayal trauma processing and healing and growth.
Right. So it's not. So what I'm hearing you say is that it's not. This abstinence period is not just for the addict, for the one who's struggling.
No.
This is for both. This is to create that space for healing for both.
Yeah. Yeah,
Both need it.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, we've had clients where they've tried to do an abstinence period, and the husband was pushing, and then the spouse gave in. Right, and so in this and I mean, they had this failed process multiple times, and that ended up revealing for the spouse that, oh my gosh, I think that I have maybe some issues with this where I'm also, like, it's not just my husband, but we have this system that isn't allowing for health to exist in our sex life. And like, that was a tough reality to come to for her. But I think the acknowledging that is for both of them. Yeah. And it's not just, we can stop now because my wife feels better. No, because that's the old way of doing things. Let me put out a fire, like the addict, let me put out a fire. And when things seem okay, then we can just go back to how it was. And this is like a full stop reset.
Yeah. Well, I think it's helpful to realize the addict or struggler may not be trying to create an unhealthy system. They may not be trying to manipulate that.
No.
I mean, some do. There's
not
bad examples.
consciously.
Right, but because they're unhealthy personally, it will inadvertently even create unhealth in the system.
Yeah.
And unless you're willing to address that, it'll just stay there and wait to be dealt with. So help the listener out who's maybe hearing all this and just feeling like, this is, you're making it too big of a deal. If you want to have sex, have sex. If you don't have sex. Like, and they're just like, whatever. So talk through what might be some of the negative impact for a couple who re-engages sexually for the wrong reasons in recovery, either to try to help fix their partner or to try to create connection. What could be some of the longer term negative impacts of that?
Yeah. To your point, Robert, in terms of the betrayal trauma.
Who's Robert?
Robert.
I have a hard time saying his nickname in English. So
Not because she doesn't, not because she can't say my name, but it's just because it's Bob.
You want to use Spanish words. Go
Spanish,
for it.
yes.
We're all about expanding our language here.
One of the negative impacts would be, then again, like an added betrayal trauma, more trauma added to the betrayed spouse. If anything, like, look at it that way for the betrayed spouse to remind yourself, oh my goodness, this is a good way for me to find healing and growth and like to be on the other side, because otherwise you're doing a detriment to your own process if you don't.
Well, what I'm hearing is like there's a level of like you're taking the pressure off of the betrayed spouse. The pressure isn't there to have to meet an expectation or a need that the spouse has. And it honestly, I feel like I'm envisioning a betrayed spouse who for the first time can just breathe and put their shoulders down and relax. Like, I don't have this thing, this cloud maybe that's over everything when there's that period of abstinence or something.
Yeah. And what you said earlier, Nick, about the airplane thing, it would be like forcing someone to get on an airplane before they're ready. It's like, well, I'm sorry, but
more traumatic.
I'm sorry, but
you have no choice.
I need to fly, right? So sorry, you need to fly with me, right? And it's and forcing them into that. It's not going to be enjoyable, right? Like, use the airplane analogy. You're not going to enjoy the idea that you're about to go to Italy for the weekend. No, you're just going to be freaked out the whole time. Like, it's going to rob any of that joy and of the connection. Like, they're not going to be present emotionally, not going to be present mentally. I mean, all of the negative impact that we talk about in like the impact letter and the disclosure process, like all of that impact is just going to be continued to resurface and re-traumatized.
And there's that fear too with the betrayed spouse that if I'm being asked to re-engage here and I don't, the fear of then what is my spouse going to do? Are they going to go do it with someone else? Are they going to go back to pornography? Like then there's that fear.
But that's their responsibility, not yours.
Totally.
Yep.
They're responsible for their choices.
Yes.
Yeah, I think about in how many relationships the struggles with pornography or engagement with other people has really communicated to that betrayed spouse the sense of I don't matter, or who I am doesn't matter. They just use my body. And so if you're in recovery and that spouse is no longer acting out or looking at porn, hey, that's great. Yeah. But if sex still makes the spouse feel like I'm just an object here for them to use, you haven't really improved anything. You've stopped behavior, but you haven't changed the way you do life. And so I think that's the negative impact is we can get too focused on, hey, and I remember some of this in my own story of feeling like, babe, I'm doing great. I haven't looked at porn in X number of days, and shouldn't you be so proud of me? And they're like, well, not really, because I didn't know you were looking at porn before. So that was, not something I saw anyway. And it wasn't so much what you did, it's the way it made me feel. And if you still make me feel the same way when you ask for sex, we're not really getting much better. So I think it's looking into that of how will that sexual connection make each other feel, not just physically, but in kind of that emotional, I'm valued, I'm seen, I'm respected, I'm wanted. And if that's the heart behind it, I think you're in a better place. But if that's not the heart behind it, then engaging in sex too early will really, I think, just perpetuate, like you're saying, it's layering trauma on trauma.
Yeah. And distrust and broken promises, right?
Totally.
I mean, there's so many layers to that. And even the shame that comes with it after, right? Like you think you're at a better place or you're giving in and or acting out of fear. And then afterwards, you have to face this shame that comes right back at you. And
because you weren't ready.
Because you weren't ready. Yeah.
And that's so funny too. As you're saying that, I'm thinking sex with your spouse is not wrong, but you could do it at the wrong time that becomes wrong for your relationship, you know, because it's not, because what you're saying of like broken trust or things like that, that's just a small thing. Like me engaging, if we've agreed on a period of abstinence and then I re-engage too soon, that's a small like break of trust that has really far-reaching implications for marriage. So it's just like, it's these small things that you're doing that make a big impact. But even the good things or okay things in your marriage aren't always okay. Interesting.
Yeah. And there's also a word that you like, Nick, allostasis. There's that.
Our friend Rodney loves that word.
Allostasis.
An hour practicing it before he taught a session using it.
We love you, Rodney. Please hear we love you.
Yeah, of course
we do love you.
But yeah, I mean, the allostasis part basically of the brain resetting for the addict.
Yes.
Right. So, I mean, there's like all these neurochemical levels that have been going haywire for so long. And part of what's great about the abstinence period is that there gets to be a pause on that. And there's time for the brain to reset. And which means at the beginning of it, you're going to be feeling withdrawals like of an abstinence period. Right. Like so not just the fear that might be engaged or part of it, but then also, your brain cycles, dopamine cycles, not being at what would be a more typical pattern. And so to re-engage too soon, you're also not giving your brain that time to reset, to find a new normal.
An illustration, and I'm going to say this, Nick, you and people who went to the summit know you were in a boot for a while. You're a runner and you got hurt. And for you got hurt and something needed to change. You needed time for your body to heal before you were able to re-engage. Because if you re-engage too soon, you're going to do damage that ultimately can never be undone. So you have to leave. Like I just think of, I was living with my in-laws and I remember my father-in-law got his had surgery on his shoulder, and he had to have a recovery period where he was able to give it time to heal and then start doing physical therapy and develop that muscle again so that he could actually use it. Because if he re-engaged too soon, sorry, bro, the shoulder's gone. Like, we're cutting the shoulder off. It's out of here, you know? And so I think that if you put it in that perspective, that's maybe a little easier to, I don't know, that seems easier to swallow, that reality when you put it in a different context, but that same principle is being applied to this scenario and this situation in a marriage.
Yeah, I mean, it feels punitive for, for a lot of, and also to say there's some spouses that like not having sex, even though they have fears mixed in with it, like it also feels punitive to them, right? There's some spouses where it's like, I enjoy sex. I don't want to stop. Like, so why do I have to stop? And so, I mean, there's all this stuff mixed in with it. But to say that, no, giving yourself the time that you need.
Yeah.
And some people feel, well, we want to start a family. Maybe you're a young couple and you want to start a family, and like I just have to ignore these fears so we can get pregnant.
Kids don't make anything easier.
No.
Like they're
It's the
amazing,
opposite.
but they don't make things easier.
No.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, let's get to the last one. I mean, this is obviously open-ended, but just what are some final encouragements that you guys might have for couples experiencing fear of sex during the recovery and healing process?
Your fears are valid.
Yeah.
Like they're not wrong. You're not weak for having fears. We don't want to just brush these aside or ignore them. They're there for a reason. And like all of our trauma, we have these trauma responses, and that's what fear is, right? Fear is the result of pain.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter if you're the addict or the spouse. If you have fear, it's the result of pain. Don't ignore it. Don't try and brush it aside. Like figure out why it's there. And it doesn't mean that the fear will just totally dissipate, but you'll be able to navigate through it, right? Yeah. Like you'll be able to approach sex. And one thing that I realized we didn't talk about is some people have fear of sex because it's painful. And it's like, that's a real thing, right?
Yeah.
And
Totally.
so like there's
don't just get over it. It's
No.
not just an emotional
No.
block.
No.
Sometimes it could be emotional.
Yeah, sometimes it's emotionally
Sometimes it's
connected,
physical.
and identify the fears and see what's there. Sometimes it's physical. Go see your doctor.
Yep.
And so just to say that, like for some of you, this isn't just I just need to, no. There may be some actual physiological things going on.
Yeah. And there are physical things that can be done to help. I think some spouses need to hear that. I've heard Heather and Ashley talk about it after the women's Q&A sessions, that wives are like, wait, what? Like I can get help for that? Like I just thought it was going to be painful. And like, no, you could actually get help. It could get better.
Yeah. Yeah. So the fear's there for a reason. It's connected to some pain. Find out why it's there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess on my side of things would be, and you mentioned this, Trevor, a little bit ago, don't compare yourself with other people, especially in this process of this recovery. And you're in group. Everybody is externally in different scenarios, and yet your process is your own. And this is a great opportunity then for you and your spouse to continue engaging as a team and partnering together for the rest of your life. And that only can happen if you both are intentionally focused on what works for you, what's healthy for you. And so just to have that reminder of, especially with sex, right? Like it's going to look different than everybody else. And that is okay. That is how it should be. It's what's healthy for you and your spouse.
What I thought of in terms of final encouragement was this is where you need to remember the beauty of your vows. And that's assuming, again, that both sides of the equation are wanting to make it work, want to honor their marriage vows. And if that's where you are, you have this beauty of you both said, till death do us part, which means if you re-engage too early and it doesn't go well, have grace for one another and realize we're going to be here tomorrow and we're going to be married the next day and the next day. And we have time on our side. Now, I know we don't have eternal time on our side, but like, if we're not in this rush to fix it or do it perfectly the first time, and we can just give each other and ourselves grace, that if one of us isn't ready and the other is, like, well, we got time. Let's just keep working it through and realize that's the beauty of your vows, that I've said, I'm going to be here and we're looking to make this work. And, if that's where you're at in your marriage, celebrate that side of it, that the vows hold you in this place to say, we've got time enough to work it out. And just lean into that.
Yeah. Just sex is not your whole marriage. It's an aspect of it.
Yeah.
It's an important aspect, but it's not everything. You didn't marry, you didn't marry having sex with your person. You married your person. Like, that's a terrible way to say it, but that's the reality. I chose this person to marry this person. That's who I want to do life with, emotionally, physically, spiritually, all of it. And so just know that this is an aspect, not that it's not important, but it's just an aspect of it. Man, just this conversation, I'm so glad that we had this conversation, and I'm so glad you guys came in and you were a part of this one. What I'm just summarizing, it is normal to have fear around this in recovery and healing. It's very important, essential is a better word, to have support, whether it's a therapist, whether it's counselors, whether it's a group. And that fear, I love what you said, fear isn't a hurdle. But it is something that we do need to work through. We shouldn't avoid it. We do need to press into that and to use the word, Rebecca, that you used, curiosity. That's huge.
And if you're stuck in your fear, get help.
Totally.
It's okay to acknowledge I'm stuck in some
Absolutely.
fear.
Absolutely.
And that's why help exists.
Yep.
Yeah.
And ultimately that sex can be healthy again.
Yeah.
It can actually, and for
You're
some
here.
maybe it was healthy, maybe some it wasn't healthy, but
Mhm.
it can be healthy if you
Yeah.
push into this
Mhm.
Yeah.
and do this process. So Bob, Rebecca, thank you so much for your
Yep.
time.
Thanks for having us.
Love you
Great work,
Thank
guys.
you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, appreciate you.
And wherever you're at on your journey, Pure Desire is here to help create a roadmap for your healing. If you or someone you know is impacted by sexual brokenness or betrayal trauma, go to puredesire.org and let's start the healing journey today. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. Each week we put out new content to help you on the road to healing and freedom. And lastly, never stop being healthy.